Greetings. My name is Cameron Miller, and this is Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. And this is a reflection for the readings for the second Sunday of Lent, which in our lectionary here at Trinity Place includes a poem. And this week it's Longing for Prophets by Shirley Kaufman. Now this sermon did not leave from the station I expected it to leave from, nor did it arrive at the destination I thought I was aiming toward. Just so you know. Now, last week, we wrung out our fears. We reached down and touched them and named those fears to ourselves and, in a pretend gesture, pooled them with one another's. This week, it's about grief and about loss. Now, in the gospel that we read, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. He weeps in grief and anger, probably, some fear too, because he knows what's coming. Now, our Wednesday noon Zoom book club talked about losses this week, reading together a book about loss, at least initially. We don't exactly know how it's going to end. And I actually tried not to talk about loss and grief today. I got more than halfway through a totally different sermon and got stuck and could not move any further, no matter how hard I pushed. And that happens sometimes when I try to avoid a topic when writing a sermon. It's as if the sermon is a donkey and it stops in the middle of its tracks and it says, nope, ain't going no further. And that's when I know I need to be talking about something that I don't want to talk about. So here we are with Jesus, weeping over crushed hopes, ruined expectation, bitter disappointment, and sorrow for what has been and what will be. And there must, as I said, also have been some fear mixed in there because he knew that Herod was stalking him. Now, I think we read these Jesus stories without ever thinking about what was going on all around Jesus and his contemporaries at the time. It wasn't a nice world, especially for someone in Jesus' line of work. Their ice-pick eyes, as Shirley Kaufman described them. Their ice-pick eyes, their weeping willow hair, their clenched fists beating at heaven, in her poem, Longing for Prophets. In the 50 years that kind of sandwiched Jesus on either side, there were messiahs and prophets aplenty. Jesus would have grown up hearing stories about those prophets and messiahs and hearing people either cheer them on or live in fear of what their rebellion would wrought upon their village. Here are some names and descriptions of prophets and messiahs that we have vague but specific historical records of, revolutionaries Jesus grew up knowing about. There was Hezekiah or Ezekiel, both names, who might have actually been the original founder of the Zealots, or what would have become the Zealots eventually. And he led what we would call a guerrilla army 50 years before Jesus was born. And he wound up beheaded without a trial and his followers rounded up and killed. Then there was Judas, son of Ezekiel, who raised an army and attacked Herod's palace in Sepphoris, stole the weapons and the riches from the palace, and then disappeared from history. There was Simon of Perea, a slave in Herod the Great's household. And just a few years before Jesus was born, after Herod the Great had died, he gathered a following and attacked numerous of Herod's palaces, burning down the one in Jericho and several others, as it says. His army was defeated and he was chased down and, big surprise, beheaded. Then there was Athronges, the shepherd. He was described as taller and stronger than anybody else, and he had 4 brothers of the same stature. He led a 2-year rebellion against Herod the Great's son and successor, as well as the Roman army. Jesus was born in the midst of the shepherds' rebellion. It was put down, and while his brothers were captured and dispatched with, we don't exactly know what happened to Athronges. Then there was Judas the Galilean, not Judas the disciple that we know about, but Judas the Galilean, who led a rebellion against a census that we know about from Jesus' birth narratives, but that actually happened, the census, several years after Jesus was born. Judas's rebellion failed, obviously, and of course, and Judas the Galilean was killed. Several of his sons, however, were then became, decades later, the leaders and messiahs in a Jewish-Roman war from 66 to 70 that led to the destruction of the temple and the genocide of Jews in Judah and Galilee. And it was his grandson, I believe, who led the famous last stand on top of Masada. So, you got Ezekiel, Judas, son of Ezekiel, Simon of Perea, Athronges the shepherd, Judas the Galilean, and of course, in Jesus' own day, John the Baptist. They were the Hall of Famers in that first millennium era. These are the names of famous prophets and messiahs that Jesus would have been able to rattle off their names with the same familiarity that I can say Michael Jordan or LeBron James or Keem Olajuwon, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Steve Nash. Very familiar. They must have been the prophets that Jesus wept over when he said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you kill the prophets and stone to death those who are sent to you." I weep that way sometimes when I hear another report about climate change losses that could have been stopped or arrested, but decade after decade, we have kept doing what we know will be the ruin of our environment and our ruin along with it. It's that kind of weeping that Jesus was doing. It's a special kind of grief for what we have lost or are about to lose, because we know it didn't have to be that way. It didn't have to happen. That kind of weeping grief. Can't you almost see Jesus looking out over the city? His eyes pooling, a reddishness streaking his cheeks, which are glistening with moisture. He's scared, to be sure, and the warning about Herod looking for him ringing in his ears. But even more than fear, he's heavy with sorrow, deep sadness filling his chest. You know, I sense that many, if not all of us, carry some sorrow and sadness these days. There's so much we see, what with images from Ukraine filling the airspace. But we're also old enough to have had beliefs and expectations for our nation, for the world, for our families, for our children, for our professions, expectations that have simply evaporated. Just about every one of our institutions has suffered historic cracks in the foundations. I mean, you and I both know that the church is undergoing historic change. I mean, just think about that columbarium at 520 South Main Street, the big Gothic building we left. Think about that columbarium as a metaphor. Who ever placed their loved one's ashes in a church columbarium without expecting that that stone edifice was safely there forever and a day. Churches, especially big ones, don't close. But education has been rattled and shaken too, even before the pandemic, but especially since then. Whether college or kindergarten, the teaching profession has changed and is changing more and more even now. But so too is banking. Heck, if digital currency takes hold, there won't be any more banks. Oh, and doctors and nurses. The medical profession was undergoing a huge overhaul well before the pandemic, but for 2 years now, they've been called on to serve in ways they never expected. I was just told that the Air Force Reserves are what's keeping one of our local hospitals going. It is difficult to think of a profession that hasn't been or is not going through dramatic reformation of one kind or another. It's a vast reckoning of some kind, brought on by, I don't know what, who knows what. Rapid technological change, economic restructuring, globalism, information technology, outgrowing historic institutions never meant to serve so many people so much so fast. Whatever it is, and however it's unfolding, we see what was and what has been lost, and we grieve, even feel some anger sometimes at what's been taken from us. Like the poem asks, bring back the prophets who can tell us what's next, who in the ashes can tell us what's going to happen. Well, I am no prophet. But here's what I know. It's what I know about living with fear, about living with the unknown, about living with loss, about living with grief. When we do it alone, we suffer. When we do it alone, we suffer. When we can hold hands with one another, sit in each other's presence while we wonder and pray and worry, even if we're not talking about it, then we get through it. To be alone in our grief and our loss is the very definition of suffering. When we are with others, even if the others can't take it away or do anything about it, we do better. I also know that that's what Jesus did. He continued to gather his friends around a table and share bread and wine. He continued to tell stories and imagine possibilities. He continued to share love, let them know not only that he loved them, but that he needed their love. He didn't stop asking them when they failed, and he didn't stop needing them when he was hanging from the cross. And some of them made sure that he didn't go through that alone either. So I don't know what to tell you about all these changes that we're going through. The big ones that are rocking the boat, and the little ones that only you know about. But I do know that when and if we can navigate them together with one another, we will be stronger and better and safer for it. I'm grateful that this place and this community of people is one in which tears can be shared out loud, and prayers can be shared, and hands can be held. We're navigating some big changes, my friends. And that means, among other things, some big losses. Let's keep being present to one another. Peace be with you, and thank you for being part of this worship. in this community